Hi, welcome to Shakespeare Month for July 2018, and I'm happy to announce that this month the play we're looking at is All's Well That Ends Well, which is a pretty lesser known play, one of Shakespeare's lesser known plays. I don't think it was ever performed. It's supposed to be written in between like 1604 1605 and was included in the first folio, but I don't think there are records of it being performed during Shakespeare's lifetime. So if you are going with the whole Francis Bacon thing like I am, this could have been written just for the code. I don't think that's really true, but there are a lot of changes that happened in the first folio that that maybe match up with what was being encrypted in there. So I'm getting off topic already. So All's Well That Ends Well is a kind of a weird play, and it's one that I've been slightly familiar with but haven't really studied before now. So it's got a lot of comedic elements. It's got a lot of weird themes and a lot of similar things to things that we've seen in the plays we've previously studied. So that should make some of these kind of tropes and little clumps of it seem familiar to you. So I'm just going to start with the basic outline of what happens in this play. So All's Well That Ends Well centers on Helen and Bertram, two young folks. And then we've got kind of their family, the courts of France and of Italy. So when we open this play, we have Bertram is the Count of Roussillon. His father has just died, so he's just inherited this, his father's title. And his father was a steward to the King of France, or some kind of support figure to the King of France. So Bertram is going to go to the court to the King of France to serve at his leisure. Now his mother, the Countess, has taken a young ward. That's Helen. Her father has just died. And her father was a famous, really skilled physician, doctor. So Helen is a lesser courtier. She's doesn't have the high rank that the Countess, that family has, but she is in love with Bertram, and he's completely indifferent to her. So the first couple scenes of this play, we see she's crying. She should be crying because her father is dead, but she's crying because she loves Bertram. The Countess figures it out and confronts her, and she tells her, there's a whole scene of, think of me as your mother. And she's like, oh no, I don't want to think of you as my mother because then Bertram would be my brother. And there's a whole back and forth about that till she finally comes out and says, yeah, I love him. It seems, I'm just going to say for the modern perspective, it seems a little pathetic with what comes out of this play, but she's very plucky and really enterprising in getting what she wants. So, meanwhile, Bertram is at court to the King of France, and all the courtiers are going over to Italy to fight on either side of this Italian conflict, which France is neutral towards, so in those days, the men are just going to make their fortunes at war, basically. But Bertram is ordered by the king to stay behind. He's too young, and so he doesn't get to go off with his friends and seek his fortune in war. Helen, after confessing her love of Bertram to his mother, the Countess, it turns out that the King of France is really sick. And so Helen comes up with a plan to go to him and to try to cure him with her father's prescriptions. So she does. She goes to court. To follow Bertram too. She goes to court and she offers her services to the king, who refuses them. And they get into this philosophical debate, argument, and she convinces him to let her try to cure him, and that she puts up if she does not cure him and he dies, then she will pay with her life. She'll die too. But if she does cure him, he will give her something too, and that will be her choice of any of the noblemen to marry. So guess who she's got in mind for that? Well, it turns out that she does cure him, and the king orders Bertram to marry her. And Bertram is not happy. He, begs off of that, and the king chews him out and says, "You're going to marry her tonight." So that happens, and before they are able to consummate their marriage, he decides to basically run away to the wars in Italy. So he does that. Meanwhile, he's got some friends around him. We've got, a fool, a steward. We've got his friend Paralis, who is pretty shifty, and he's going to figure in later in the play, but he's the one who's got there's some exchange in the beginning with him and Helen about, virginity and warfare, and they're kind of making these military puns and arguments, and that's a fun little exchange, but he's a pretty shifty character. So we'll see him later, but Bertram runs away to the wars. And Helen, of course, is upset. She goes back to the Countess, who is not happy that her son is behaving that way. He sends Helen a letter that says, "I'll be your husband when you give me this ring, the ring that he wears, and have gotten yourself with my child." So, it's an impossible task. So Helen, this is taking longer to explain than I thought. So it gets more complicated. So Helen says she's going on a pilgrimage, but really she goes to Florence to follow Bertram. And meanwhile, I've got to go back and forth here. This is where it gets tricky, as you'll remember from Twelfth Night and the other things we've seen. So, meanwhile, Bertram is acquitting himself well in the Italian wars, and he and his shifty friend Paralis are making it with the ladies over there. So they're doing that. Bertram's other companions try to convince him that Paralis is not, he's not honorable, and he is basically a leech, and he will betray Bertram. He is just no good. And Bertram, he's loath to consider that possibility, so they hatch this plan to, this is reminding me of Henry IV Part 1, where they trick Falstaff, but they disguise themselves as Italians, kidnap Paralis, and try to get him to give up secret information about Bertram. So we have this whole little subplot. That happens. They kidnap him. They speak in this Italian gibberish. They tell that he gives up all this information. He says bad things about Bertram. So he's found out. And I actually watched this lecture about, he gives a list of names, which mean pretty much nothing even to scholars, except for these people giving this lecture point out that all these names, they have to do with people in France that at the time this play was written, it would have been like an inside joke. All the names of these guys match up with names of the French royalty, and at that time it was really confusing between the religious struggles. There's these three religious factions, but long story short, it's basically just a really inside joke, and it shows that Shakespeare, the author, really had an intimate knowledge of France to make these really layered inside jokes. And it reminded me that Francis Bacon spent several years at court in France and would have known all these people pretty well. So that's just my little connection there. So we've got that subplot with Bertram and his shifty friends. Helen, sometimes Helena, but mostly Helen. She arrives in Florence, and she meets a widow and her daughter that Bertram's been trying to seduce, and she becomes friends with them and offers money to the widow to have her daughter help her with Bertram. So, here's her plan. Bertram is trying to bed this girl, Diana, and Helen comes up with a plan that she'll do what is a convention, a plot device called a bed trick. So Bertram thinks he's going to bed with Diana, but then in her place is going to be Helen. And she gives Diana a ring that the King of France had given to her. This is where I've got to keep track of this. And Diana, because Helen has got to get the ring, and she's got to convince Bertram that she's with his child. So, as part of that, she gives Diana the ring that the King of France gave her, and Diana, when she meets up with Bertram, says, yes, like I'll marry you. He gives her promises that he loves her. So, yes, we can rendezvous. She has him give her his ring, and then she gives him the ring that Helen's given her, and says, I'll give it back to you after we consummate our love. So that's switched, and then this happens off stage, but this switch is made. So Bertram thinks he's sleeping with this girl Diana, but it's really Helen. And so since Bertram had given Diana his ring, she now gives it to Helen. And she has bedded her husband, who had run away before they could consummate their marriage. So that's all square. That's a really, it's just a really interesting device, and it was used in some Renaissance plays, but actually it is in the Bible and in Arthurian legends. In the Bible, I can find it was in Genesis, Rachel and Leah, I guess. I don't know the exact story, but there is some biblical precedent. It was in Arthurian legends and some Renaissance plays. This bed trick of switching, you think you're sleeping with someone and it's actually somebody else. It's dark, so who knows. Then this is where it gets more complicated. So Helen goes off. This is where it gets really tricky. She has already told the Countess that Bertram was acting in the way he was, and the Countess says, you're my family. I'm, disowning Bertram. You're my child. Everyone is saying, Bertram, why don't you love this girl? She doesn't have high station, but she's virtuous, and that's not good enough for him. And then the King of France says, I'll give her titles, and he still doesn't want to be married to her. And that's part of what happened before he fled to Italy. So Helen fakes her death. This is off stage. So Bertram... Oh, what happened before... I'm sorry, this is complicated even for me. What happened before is that when Helen had said she was going on a pilgrimage, the Countess wrote to Bertram and said she's gone, so hoping that he would come home if his wife's not there. Now Helen fakes her own death, and so he immediately, it's safe to come home, so he comes home, and thinking she's dead, he consents to marry another nobleman's daughter. Now, Diana, the widow, the one he was trying to seduce, and her mother come to the King of France, and she at first, says how Bertram treated her, how he wronged her, and Bertram gets backed into a corner. He starts lying about what happened, but then the king sees that Bertram has the ring, which he had given to Helen, that Helen gave to Diana, that Diana gave to him, and he thinks it's Diana's. So the king recognizes that ring, says, you never would have gotten this from Helen. She would have never given it to you unless she was in your bed or she was dead. And you swear that you have not slept with her. So now Bertram's in a jam, and then there's this riddle with Diana where she says, that he wronged her because he was going to, take her virginity, but she's still a maid because he actually slept with Helena, and it's all very confusing. Well, then Helena shows up, and she has Bertram's ring. She tells him, I may be with child, and he has this really quick realization or turnaround that, you did all that for me, then okay, I love you now, and we'll be happy. And that's basically it. I might have left out one or two little plot things, but it's one of those tricksy, lots of double, triple crossing kind of plays. And yeah, that's it. That's the gist of it. It's really interesting because Bertram is, I think in a lot of productions he's very handsome, so you can see how you'd be infatuated with someone who shows such a not a great character. There is some excuse to be made that he's dealing with his father's death. He is, much like we saw, this is why I love Henry IV, because you really see the hero's journey, or, the journey from, that you see the journey from, not being prepared to take on this leadership role and coming into that. So I really like having that as a foundation, because we see how Bertram, he could have gone through the same journey, but he kind of makes cowardly decisions at every turn. And then right at the end of the play, he just does a complete 180. So it's a little hard to sympathize with him. And also, I think so. But in the production I'm going to talk about in a moment, I think they do a good job of him just being a little young and clueless, so it's not that he's malicious or anything. And then Helena, Helen, sorry, I keep calling her Helena. They say both in the play, but I think mostly it's Helen. She just loves him, and it's part of the dynamic between them is that she's of a much lower station than him, but by her own her cunning and perseverance, that she makes it happen anyway, which is kind of a radical thing, especially back then. And even in the Victorian times, they hate, this play has really not been performed very much. Victorians hated her. They hated that character for being so just, unbecoming of a woman to be just going after what she wants. And, I can see how people in the old days would see that. It's very masculine, but she's also very want to say humble. She says, I just, I'll be your servant. I don't, I will love him even though I know he'll never love me. And she's got that side to her, but then she also is like, I'm going to cure the king. I'm going to tell him to make him my husband. I'm going to go, I'm going to go after him. I'm going to trick him. So she does everything to get him. So it's a really interesting female role. There's a lot of plucky Shakespearean characters, but she's a really interesting one, and it's an interesting dynamic. I find it odd, but it's pretty entertaining. And then we have, of course, with Paralis, you have one of those witty, kind of terrible people that your young hero shouldn't be hanging around. There's one part in this production where they just make fun of his clothes, and that's all he is, and he has some of the wittier exchanges too. So those parts you'll recognize from Twelfth Night for sure. And I know there's another one we just did too where they have that same dynamic, but I'm still thinking about this one. I'm thinking about the deeper meaning of it because this one hasn't come so easily to me. So I'm going to keep thinking about that throughout this month. Yeah. And I'll say the version I'm recommending, there's only one. There are two. There was a 1981, I think, made for the BBC version that's I can't find online, but it may be available from a library. And then the one I'm recommending is the Globe Theater, the same place that I recommended for Twelfth Night. They did a production of that, which is really good. And I really love. I know you have to rent or buy it from their website, which I'll link below. But seeing them on the Globe stage, I really like those. I think the comedy plays so much better too in these when they're in that setting, because a lot of the comedy is physical and timing, and sometimes when you see something filmed for TV, there's just no life in it. So I really like this one. Like I said, Bertram he's more of a hapless kind of youth than somebody who's, really, that you really think is mean-spirited. So that's the one I recommend. And my goodness, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to say about this before I say goodbye. It's a funny one. I will say the thing that I think about is why would you put so much effort into loving someone who really doesn't prove themselves worthy of it at all. There's no real justification for why she loves him. She just does. And he makes excuses for not loving her, that it's her station. And then he doesn't really have an excuse after that until the end when he realizes that in a flash that he could love her. And this, I will say that this is called a problem play, and that's because the end he has a turnaround that is, has no basis in psychological realism, I guess. But that's okay. It can be archetypal or mythological. That's fine with me, but it's just a little like, we got to wrap this play up. It's comedy, so it's got to be happy. This is what happens. That's what it feels like. But I think there can be a redeeming quality of love in this too. I mean, her love is so true. And all's well that ends well. It's kind of like the end justifies the means, because she does a lot of tricksy things, but she doesn't hurt anyone. I mean, like he does. But I think there is a redemptive power of love, that she's so true that at the end he can't deny it. And I think that if we believe his turnaround, that reforms him. So I won't say that's all there is to it. There's got to be a lot more. But I think that's a pretty good arc for a play. So I'm going to leave it at that. If I think of something else, I'll post another video this month. But enjoy. Please watch the Globe Shakespeare video. If you have trouble streaming, I've heard a couple people say they had trouble streaming. I buy them, so I download them and have them forever. And if you have a couple people you can watch it with, that's a great option. But I would say if you have tried another play from that website and had trouble streaming, I would just, reach out to their customer service. But yeah, it's one of the least performed, least popular of Shakespeare's plays, so enjoy. And I will talk to you next month, where I think we might do a tragedy. I feel like we haven't done enough of those yet. So anyway, enjoy. Bye.